Okay, on average, autism is diagnosed at around 4 years old, but many doctors and even parents can spot some signs much earlier, like 2 years old. But what is it exactly, and why does it seem to happen a few years after a child is born? Dr. Tarnow with the Tarnow Center for Self-Management is here to answer those questions. Please welcome him to Great Day. Good morning. We're hearing more and more and more about autism, but let's back up a second and explain what is it exactly. And I think some of the confusion too is how it presents itself in various people.
Well, one of the things about autism, it's very, very different in each person. And that's when sometimes it's hard to make a diagnosis. But the most focus is on their social relationships. So around 2 years of age is when children are expected to talk, have social relationships, and understand interaction. And for these children, it's very, very difficult. And so most of them, at 2, they're not talking, and they're not using words, and they're not making eye contact, and there seems to be a big change in their development.
Yeah, and what's happening in the brain when that happens?
Well, I think that what we're understanding is that the brain, this is a neurological disorder. So the brain is different in children with autism. And one of the things that we have found in our research study is that children have these abnormal rhythms in their brain. They have these spikes and waves, which are precursors for seizures. And so I think that that is what's disrupting their development, these abnormalities in the brain and the firing in the brain. Which disrupts development.
Yeah, which kind of is related to like even things like ADHD and ADD. We see that same thing.
Yes, you see abnormalities in the brain with that. Yeah.
We've heard autism. Then I hear sometimes people say, "Oh no, it's Asperger's. It's on the spectrum."
Well, what we did is that about maybe 8 years ago, we changed the diagnosis of autism to be 4 different categories. And so autistic spectrum disorder is the broad one. Some children are diagnosed with PDD, which is pervasive developmental delay, and they have multiple delays in all the developmental lines. Some people have the sort of classic autism, which is the lack of speech, the difficulty in having social relationships, and they have a lot of mannerisms and
like the restrictive
things.
and repetitive, yeah.
Yeah.
Like Grant would say, he would get the paper and he would just tear and tear and tear and tear and tear, or repeating certain words and things over and over again. When it comes to causes, one of the things that over the last few years that's been such a big debate was the idea that somehow vaccinations caused it. That really is shaken down to, it's a coincidence that children seem to present at around 2 years old, and that's kind of the time where they're getting their other series of vaccinations.
Exactly. So they get their injections and the vaccinations, and then parents then notice the changes in personality and they associate it with the vaccination. That is absolutely wrong. And what's weird about it is the person who did that research was fraudulent, and he changed the data to prove that. So, and that was done in England, and so that is now very, very clear. No other study has shown that the vaccinations are really the cause of autism.
Yeah.
This is a disease that just comes out when a person is expected to have social relationships.
Yeah, and with that said, while there's not any one cause, there are some things that are kind of relative to it. Another sibling with autism, for example, older parents, certain genetic conditions?
Yes. So there are certain genetic conditions like, we have the genetic pieces of it, but things like Down syndrome, and the other is the early childhood in terms of prematurity. So children who are very, very, very premature have a higher incidence in terms of their developmental process because of that prematurity.
All right, how do we determine a diagnosis? Because almost every parent I've talked to with a child with autism, they'll say what they suspect, but it's taken a while before they've gotten an actual diagnosis, and in some cases they were misdiagnosed.
Yes, a lot of pediatricians, when they see a child come in and they're not having speech or having some social relationships, they'll hesitate to make the diagnosis because of the concern of the severity of this.
And difference between a pediatrician and a psychiatrist, let me say that.
And so the pediatrician is usually the first who will say, I think there's something wrong and we need to refer it to a child psychiatrist. And then what we do is make a very comprehensive evaluation. We have to understand exactly what level they're developing and what are the things they can do and what they can't do. And from that, we make a really comprehensive diagnosis of their functionality. That's the most important part of this.
Yeah. All right. When we come back, we want to talk about something that came out in the Wall Street Journal, because for the longest we've said with autism there is no cure. Well, this article said, is that necessarily the case, right? Because there could possibly be a cure, or is it just the fact that some kids might seem to grow out of it, other ones may have been misdiagnosed? So we'll take a look at that. The other thing I want to look at is CBD oil. We have heard that that is the cure-all for everything. They're even having CBD oil parties, like a Tupperware party. All right, so I want to get your take on that, because there are certain things, by the way, that should not be exposed to the autistic brain. We'll talk about that when we come back.